This is Jeffrey Tucker, Brownstone Institute. The last 6.5 years have led to a kind of complete rethinking of my own assumptions concerning the relationship between business and government. My own intellectual tradition, I think, has a tendency to valorize business and demonize government, and that's understandable. Adam Smith used to talk about the glories of the butcher, the baker, and the brewer. Well, with modern pharmaceutical industry, with big tech, with the military-industrial complex, we're not talking about bakers and butchers and brewers. We're talking about something else entirely. And it was revealed unto us just to what extent corporate culture, corporations as institutions are working so tied so intimately with government to an extent to which I didn't really understand. And it's caused me to have to rethink a lot of biases I've had. But, I would say the same thing is true for people on the left who, and I've had many people tell me this, that they've always thought of government as sort of the solution to the problem of business, that ever since the New Deal, we've been invited, or if not earlier, we've been invited to think of the government as a restraining force on the ferocious winds of capitalism and free enterprise. And we need more government, therefore, when you see corporations becoming ever more powerful and exploitative, the answer is to turn to the public sector. That view has also been shattered as people on the left saw what government was doing: stay-at-home orders, violations of free speech, even violating religious freedoms, the freedom of association and travel, and so on. So everything seems to be a little bit of an upheaval concerning our traditional ideological categories. I had been wishing for a long time that somebody would write a book that would revisit this exact question and lay it out in a way that's more realistic, and also look back in history to and raise the question: Are we really looking at this correctly, or is there a different way to understand this long history? The great struggle between, as Murray Rothbard put it, power and market is often, even in Rothbardian terms, a cooperative and a exploitative relationship between big business and big government, which bleeds over into media and tech and medicine and every other area of life. Well, it just so happens that a book on this exact subject has been given unto us, like dropping from the heavens into my lap. The name of the book is Cronyism, and I'll introduce you now to the author, Patrick Newman. Dr. Patrick Newman, it's so good to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be on this show and to be promoting my new book, Cronyism, Rise of the Corporatist State, 1849 to 1929. It's been a long time in the making, and it's built off of a lot of you could say sedulous research, painstaking research over the years, and building on a lot of what Murray Rothbard had written about. And even though it's a historical book, I think it has a lot of relevance for the present day, and I'm really excited to be here talking with you about it.
Well, and this is why the book is so important, because I think it just shatters, everybody's assumptions about these things, particularly concerning the era about which you're writing. I had been familiar with some of this from the progressive era, quite a lot of it actually, but factoring that historical analysis into my contemporary understanding of the way things are is, I would say, like, it's been a missing piece for me. So I think your book is incredibly important. I guess it would be called revisionist, but I don't even like that term, because it presumes that there's an orthodoxy of history, whereas it's not true. History is always asking us to re-examine facets of it, and I think your book has done this. It's really monumental. By the way, are there actually two books? I feel like I saw another one, like an accompanied volume.
Yeah, so it's really a series on cronyism, which I'll talk about what exactly I mean by that. The first book came out in 2021. It was called Cronyism: Liberty versus Power in Early America, 1607 to 1849, going through cronyism in the beginning of the United States, from the colonial era to Alexander Hamilton to through the Jacksonians and so on, using the framework of liberty versus power, as Murray Rothbard spoke about so
liberty
much.
versus
Power.
Well, I see. Yes, liberty versus power. Sorry, misunderstood.
Yeah.
Okay, yes, of course.
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, so you have these, really, Rothbard always thought that history could be viewed through the lens of liberty, right? People promoting free markets and limited government is in their opposition to power, people promoting government intervention and cronyism. And really the overarching sort of point of this historical series is to write a history of cronyism, which I define as policies that benefit special interests at the public's expense, right? Because as you mentioned earlier, and as you've done such a great job exposing, most of the time when we hear that government passes intervention X, Y, or Z, it's to benefit the public, right? It's to keep us safe from foreign enemies. We need a central bank to stabilize the economy, keep inflation low. We need federal regulation of food and drugs to keep those products safe and to help consumers, so on and so forth. That's the public interest theory of regulation, and that's what's always advocated by politicians, by bureaucrats, even businesses lobbying for legislation. Well, that's always the stated reason. I would argue that the real reason is different, right? It's cronyism. You have various special interests, businesses, unions, various professionals like doctors or economists and so on, advocating policies. They say they're going to benefit the public, but they're actually just going to benefit themselves and their allies at the expense of the public. And that's really what's always going on in government. And that's what this series, such as this latest book, is trying to uncover.
In many ways, I suppose it's an attempt to update or take forward in time what the project that Murray himself started with, Conceived in Liberty. Would you see it that way?
Yes, absolutely. So Conceived in Liberty was a 4-volume series. There's actually a 5th volume that I helped edit and publish on colonial America. So Rothbard started from Jamestown in 1607. He went a bit earlier than that, but really, you think of Jamestown, and he went all the way through the Revolutionary War. And those are in the 4 volumes that had been published during his lifetime. And then he had a 5th volume on the Constitution in the early years of the American Republic. So really the whole, you could say, series goes from about 1607 to 1791. And then, of course, his next big history book, which was also never published when he was alive, was on the Progressive Era. And in both of those works, Rothbard was always trying to show the elites behind government intervention in how they were benefiting at the public's expense. And ever since I've read Rothbard's history, I fell in love with it because it's so refreshing and so unique. And I think it has so much potential and relevance for the world we live in today.
Yeah, I want to pause you there and just quickly reflect on a certain point. Now, as if memory serves, Murray was tasked with sort of writing a complete American history, but it is also often what happens with him is that he starts writing, and he's done one book only covered 2 or 3 years, right? And so this is what happened with Conceived in Liberty, and so we got those 4 volumes, and I remember seeing all the pages of the 5th volume, these little yellow pads, and you couldn't read a single thing in them. And I put them in a file drawer somewhere. When I heard that you had figured out what they said, I almost couldn't believe it. And then the volume comes out. I've not read it. I should have read it, but I haven't. But the reviews were wild. There was like this. I can't believe this is a masterpiece, and you did this. You figured this out. I don't. Am I telling this accurately?
Yeah. You are. So when writing Conceived in Liberty, you're right. It was originally supposed to be a 2-volume work on American history, 3-volume work from the founding, from the colonial era all the way up to the present day, which at the time was, say, the early 1960s. And as in Rothbardian fashion, as you mentioned, he ended up producing a 5-volume work on just early American history, basically the colonial era in the American Revolutionary War, and then the Constitution. And for each of those books, from what I'm told and what I could see, is that he handwrote them and then he dictated them into a recording machine. And then someone would listen to it and type it out, and he would look at it and he would edit it. This was back in the Stone Age, right before the internet, before even modern word processors and all of that. And the long and short of it is that he dictated the 5th volume, but the tapes got lost or something happened to them. I was never able to find out.
I remember hearing about like wax reels or something.
Exactly. Yeah. I've heard multiple renditions, but the only thing I was able to definitively prove was that something happened to him. Right. So all that remained was literally this stack of about 500 pages. And the first 50 pages had been typed, but then the rest of it, right around the time of Shays' Rebellion, the big rebellion in Massachusetts around like 1786, I want to say, it goes into his handwriting. And I posted some pictures on social media. It's scribble. It's scribble. I have bad handwriting. I had bad handwriting all throughout my education. I mean, this was something else because he wrote in cursive, and it was something. And I had edited the Progressive Era, which was already all typed up, and that was easy to do, type it up myself.
That by itself is a brilliant book, by the way. I just have to congratulate you for that. And your introduction to it, I maintain to this day, it's the single best thing ever written on Rothbard. That introduction is alone masterful. You get him. Your understanding of Murray is exactly according to his mind. I was so happy to read your introduction to that book called The Progressive Era, because I felt like finally somebody gets it, So congratulations on that book and that introduction.
Thank you. That was a lot of work. I'm glad you like the introduction, because I go through a lot of Rothbard as a historian and sort of his overall view of American history, which I think is an underappreciated aspect of Rothbard's thought. So when it came to Conceived in Liberty, you had 400 pages of 500 pages of this just handwritten. It was all prose. It wasn't notes. I've seen some of his actual notes for lectures, and it's just a couple of words and all that. This was actual prose. You could tell he handwrote a book. And so after I had edited the Progressive Era, I tried to tackle this, and this was this is the summer of 2018. And about a week and a half went by, and I got through like 5 pages maybe, and I was going, this might be too much, right? This, like, at this rate, I'll never get it done, or at least it will take a long time. But fortunately, you could say I found the quote unquote Rosetta Stone. This is how I sort of cracked Murray Rothbard's handwriting. And this is when you skip ahead in the book a little bit, and Rothbard gets into the Constitutional Convention, right? This obviously this titular moment in American history. A lot of founding fathers are there. They're discussing what type of government they want to have. And of course, Rothbard adds his own unique perspective on that, which we can talk about if we want. But what Rothbard did is he quoted a lot from the notes of the Constitutional Convention. from it was edited by Max Farrand. So this authoritative series, and a lot of it's James Madison as well as other founding fathers. So he would sometimes quote 2 sentences or even like 10 words. And I was able to, you could figure out a couple words, and you could go on, you could find the notes on the Constitutional Convention edited by Max Farrand online, and you can Control F. And then you can see, you got those 2 words, and so that's what the other words mean. And then you could see, okay, so this was how he wrote his G's, or this is how he wrote aggrandizing, right? Or this was how he wrote, I don't know, espionage or merrily or something, because it was all written in cursive. And then Rothbard's handwriting is really tough to read. You look at his marginalia in books, and he might write like 2 words, and that's really tough because it's hard to figure out if you can't read it. But when you've got a whole paragraph, it's actually easier because there's more words, and you can say, okay, you're not guessing, but you can literally sort of crack the code. Because if you know a couple words, then you can see, okay, what would the other word be, and so on. And that's literally how I learned his handwriting. If he didn't quote from Max Farrand, those notes on the Constitutional Convention, I don't think he'd be able to do it. He quoted some other books too, but it was really that. And that's how I learned how to read his handwriting. And once I figured out how to do that, it was still tough, but it was relatively straightforward. And this was in the age before AI, right? So I don't know if AI could do it, but I at least take pride in in knowing that I had cracked Rothbard's handwriting, and because of that, was able to bring out, in my opinion, a veritable classic Rothbardian book.
Yeah,
that I
wish. What a masterful thing that you did. I knew Murray for the 10 years before his death really well, and we often talked about the fifth volume, and he just considered it just kind of like just hopeless, that there was no chance it would ever come out again. And in fact, I used to get tired of it. People used to write me all the time saying, "Oh, you should bring out the 5th volume of Conceived and Liberty." Sorry, have you read the first 4? Shut up, And then out of nowhere, you did it, and then you produced this major, really important work on the Progressive Era, which I think you should enter. That book should enter into the Rothbardian canon as one of his great books. So again, that's very much to your credit. So so I'm a little astonished, actually, to see that you didn't just look back and work on Rothbard, which would have been enough of an achievement for one scholar's life, by the way, Patrick. But that you've been doing your own historical work, and you're a fine writer, and I'm only about 20% of the way done with your book, and the reason for that is that I'm just learning so much. There's just so much in there. So why don't we dive into your book? Your term cronyism. The goal of industry's sort of involvement in government is not just is not just profits, but is privilege, right? So the goal in every case is more or less to restrain competition, and create more of a cartel-like situation, which only government can do. Am I right about that?
Yeah. So businesses and other interest groups, they will, on the market, let me back up for a second. On the market, everybody always wants to be the single seller, or to be able to dictate their own terms. Well, I'm only going to be an economics professor if you pay me $500,000 a year or something like that. I'd love to be the only teacher, or someone would love to be the only pizzeria in a city, or only have a couple of pizzerias. Is a lot of business executives will joke. They'll say competition's good until there's too much of it, right? The problem is, it's that when businesses and other interest groups, like unions and even professionals, they try to restrict supply to raise price, you get competition, right? You have new competitors enter the fray. You have People, a part of the agreement, like a cartel agreement, they start to renege, they start to cheat, they start to secretly increase supply, lower price, and so on. So the only way you're going to get cartels and monopolies to last is if you have the government forcibly restrict competition, right? And even then, they might not always last, but the ones that do last have all sorts of government privileges, restrictions on competitors, restrictions on price cutting. They might get subsidies that no one else gets, so on and so forth. And this is really the name of the game, so to speak, right? Whatever profession you're looking at, whatever, accountants, economists, lawyers, teachers, doctors, whatever business sector of the economy you're looking at, meatpacking, food and drugs, Wall Street, banking, railroads, transportation, everybody's playing the game. Everybody's in the hustle, so to speak, past and present, right? You're lobbying DC or whatever the halls of power, wherever those are. You're lobbying Washington for special privileges. And you're also lobbying to prevent your competitors or rival interest groups from getting those privileges. And that's the name of the game, right? And that's cronyism. And cronyism is part and parcel of every government. And you just got to look hard enough. And that's really the detective work, because you see so much stuff about public interest. Public interest. It's almost as if the more people say that something's in the public interest, you know that there's a story, right? You know that deep down.
I know exactly what you mean by that. I think I sent you my article I wrote on the Biologics Control Act of 1902. This is the very first regulation of the country concerning essentially vaccines, which is a growing industry. But there was, and everybody in that literature was saying, well, there's bad batches out there and we need government to get in there and clean it up. And I thought, you know what? Based on Murray's reconstruction of the Meatpacking Act of 1906, I thought, I don't believe this story. But it took me something like 2 weeks to run it down. And then finally I found it, right? You find all the guys lobbying Washington, talking amongst themselves. We've got to get rid of these people who are just cutting our industry and shore up consumer confidence. We've got to create a new agency. Only government can do this. And then that'll leave us as the sole suppliers and boost our profits, right? They're very explicit about this. So when I found that, I was just overjoyed. But your book takes this from the early 19th century all the way through to 1929. You're doing it in industry after industry. So that's a lot of detective work.
Yeah, it is. I thank you for sending me your article. I had read it, and I found it fascinating, by the way. And I think it's great. It's great detective work, right? If we're not going to call it revisionist history, which I do agree, it somewhat stacks the deck if we call it revisionist. We could at least say we're good detectives, right? Like all good historians, you have to be a good detective. And so the book Cronyism, and I guess I have a shameless plug right here, right? The physical book. There's a lot of case studies, right? And people have written about cronyism before, or often it's called crony capitalism, though I prefer the term cronyism because why indict capitalism? People have written articles on cronyism, books with like sort of various case studies. We're going to have, like one essay on this, another essay on that, or even just a whole book on, say, cronyism in a specific industry. One of the things I wanted to do with this series is have sort of an overarching narrative, right? To actually be able to integrate all of those case studies into some sort of story. Now, you can't cover every case study in a specific period if you want a narrative, just like every good movie has to have an edit, a thorough editing. Some things get left on the cutting room floor. But I wanted to do this for the United States, just the history of the United States. And I'm up to 1929, right? So
Brilliant. Yeah,
I'm
brilliant.
going to get to the modern era.
Oh, well, the New Deal is going to be a lot of fun for you, but it's just brilliant what you did. And just to be clear on terminology, cronyism is the practice, but the result is corporatism.
Yeah. So one of the, the result, one manifestation could be corporatism, which, if businesses are lobbying for various types of cartels, which they really began to do, let's say, after the Civil War, which you could talk about if we wanted to, then you get corporatism. So I call it the corporatist state, as it's been called before. And really what we mean by corporatism is when the government creates or sort of supports various types of cartels and monopolies across the economy. So the government cartelizes the steel industry. The government cartelizes the steel workers, the workers in the steel industry. The government cartelizes the railroads. The government cartelizes the medical profession. And corporatism is sort of seen as the middle of the road between the free market and laissez-faire, where you have competition, and between outright, let's say, confiscatory socialism, right? Corporatism, we could think of it as basically fascism in its original sort of understanding of the term fascism, and that's what we saw in the United States. And we obviously, of course, still have elements of corporatism today. We have various government-sponsored cartels and monopolies that we don't even really realize, but that's just simply because the propaganda is so good, right? Because all we're taught from the cradle to the grave is that all this stuff is in the public interest, right? But in reality, behind the scenes, you have all of these special interests always lobbying to shape regulations so that they benefit while everyone else suffers.
Yeah, and I think I would say that I was going through your book, and it's fascinating, particularly concerning the railroad industry. So, and this typically happens when you get a big innovation, right? So, and immediately you got all the profiteers. They're going, well, we're going to make the big bucks off this, but we've got to restrain it, we've got to contain it, we've got to rationalize it, we've got to bring the rule of law to bear, right, on this wild west of railroads or whatever. But the people who are bringing the rule of law to bear on the industry are almost in every case the dominant players, at least the people who can reach the legislative branch, which then creates the agencies, which the industry controls invariably.
Oh, absolutely. And I'm glad you mentioned the agencies, because one key aspect of the corporatist state that's discussed in the book, and that we, of course, still see this today, is that all of these special interests, they're lobbying to create regulatory commissions, right? The Federal Trade Commission, the Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Reserve System, even something like the National Institutes of Health or the Food and Drug Administration, all this whole panoply of these government bureaucracies that are so venerated, right? And of course, you have conflicting special interests, and sometimes a special interest might love the regulatory agency, and sometimes they might not. As Murray Rothbard sometimes joked, regulatory capture is like marriage, right? There could be ups and downs and all of that, but you'd still have people stay together, and this is what happened with Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, railroads, Interstate Commerce Commission, the Federal Trade Commission, and big business, so on and so forth. And railroads are fascinating because, as you mentioned, you have this innovation, right? It's totally transforming not just the United States economy, but the world. You're able to literally move people and goods across vast swaths of land so much more quickly than you could before. And they were really the first big business in the United States. Truly a big business in that they spanned across multiple states. They had armies of lobbyists. They were actual corporations. Manufacturing companies didn't really become corporations until about the 1890s. So railroads had publicly traded shares. Wall Street was very involved in financing them and selling their securities. And what are the railroads trying to do? Well, they're just trying to get government favors, right? They're trying to get subsidies, land grants, monetary subsidies. They're trying to make sure their competitors don't get them. They're bribing politicians with free passes, and so on. And just like I love one of the lovely anecdotes I remember from cronyism was that a prominent railroad, you could say baron, Collis P. Huntington of the Central Pacific's Big Four out in California, he was known to lobby politicians in DC with lobbyiesses, so seductive female lobbyiesses, right? Which I mentioned in the book, and that's just
pots.
That's just that's just a you gotta. It's just such a colorful way of putting it, and you got to imagine. So that's how the railroads got all their money. When you ask how'd they get so powerful, right? It's that lobbyiesses, right? And it's just it's little anecdotes like that. But yeah, railroads, really the nation's first big business, and it's no surprise then that they established the first regulatory commission, right?
Yeah.
So,
and one of the things that is so I'm so fascinated by all this stuff, but one of the things the railroad industry did in the 1880s, it seems just inconceivable, that for the first time in the history of all of humanity, they changed our understanding of our understanding of and definition of time itself. They actually managed to override what everybody knew was time, for forever, and supplant local time, which is solar time, with their own version of time, all in the interest of the railroad industry. I mean, that's some enormous power right there, and kind of shocking when you think about that. So
yeah, absolutely, and they were able to standardize time, so to speak, and when we think of the railroads, there's obviously parallels, like you could say, with even AI companies now, right? This huge new innovation, and what are you seeing? You're seeing all of these tycoons, these tech giants saying we need to responsibly regulate AI, and we need to, they're getting various assistance for creating data centers or working with regulators to make sure that their products are approved, and well, the other competitors aren't, right? So companies might take information from other from other groups, but then they want to protect their code, right? And it's a similar type of process. Of course, the only difference is it's 200 odd years into the future, roughly.
Yeah, and it's been so interesting for me once you get alert to this. Like I saw this myself in the crypto world. I got involved in Bitcoin in like 2012 or 2013, and then gradually to see the industry just get ever more cartelized by a handful of companies, and then they get behind the laws and the regulations that we've got to stop this Wild West in order to prevent money laundering and bad actors, and we need government to clean up this terrible mess. But when they say government, they really mean just the top players, the legacy exchanges, and coders, and it's an attempted creation of a cartel. I mean, you see it again and again and again. You're seeing it in AI now. But the brilliant thing about your book is that you've traced it all the way back in time, so you see a sort of a consistent model. It's always this way, and it really does shatter, the myth of government serving the public interests. It's actually just serving private interests.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's definitely so. Cryptos, the crypto industry, that's a whole story in itself. Related to that is, of course, the you could just say the money industry, right? Banking. That's a fascinating interest group. Wall Street, really, in a sense, Wall Street was behind, or was a major player in at least all of the industries that I looked at, and Wall Street led by J.P. Morgan and Company, Kuhn Loeb and Company, these very prominent investment banks, as well as something like National City Bank, which is still around today as Citi. And so, of course, banking was always trying to cartelize and was trying to put restrictions on competitors or to get favorable subsidies that a central bank could provide. And you see this consistent pattern, right? You see this overwhelming pattern of just regulatory restrictions, subsidies, and this constant fight, you could say, this struggle, these battles for these regulatory commissions, where one special interest would be dominant. So, you could say a handful of railroads really had control of the federal government's disbursement of special privileges in the 1860s during the Lincoln administration. But then in the 1870s, there was a sudden reversal of fortune, and you had rival railroads. Then you had shippers, those were the merchants that paid railroads to ship their goods, including farmers. They were able to then kind of take control and get their own sorts of cronyism, and then the railroads kind of had to fight a battle. And we could look at this with Wall Street and the Federal Reserve, and I call this offensive lobbying and defensive lobbying, right? Where you have offensive lobbying is when a special interest is initiating some sort of drive to get some sort of special privileges, right? We need to regulate our industry because of X, Y, and Z, right?
Yeah.
Defensive lobbying. Oh, go on.
Offensive lobbying often is in the name of the public interest, right? Where there's some bad actors out there. We need to crack down on them, and government's going to serve the people, but actually behind the scenes, it's just an attempt by the dominant industry players to cartelize the system for themselves. For one thing, regulatory compliance always benefits big players, not small players, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're exactly right with offensive lobbying, and it's always in the public interest name, and the name of the public interest. And of course, as you mentioned, regulatory compliance tends to benefit the larger companies because they can afford those compliance costs. They can retool their production facilities, or they don't have to change them as much. They can hire the extra accountants, or they can deal with the various health and safety inspectors in ways that small businesses can't. Or, of course, they can send their lobbyists to DC. They can hire lobbyists. They can have an entire office in the state or federal capital, right, to make sure that their interests are understood. A small company with 5 people can't. You can't do it.
Or another possibility here too is that they can examine what things they do as a company that their competitors don't do, and then push those processes, those institutional practices that they undertake that the competitors don't do as the required norm. I'm thinking here, for example, of health insurance. After World War II, you're going to get this to this eventually, in all of your work, but there's only the big players that were providing the health insurance as a means to get around wartime price controls. That's like, okay, we're going to pay our workers more by giving you medical insurance. And then after World War II, suddenly that gradually becomes a kind of requirement. Well, that's necessarily going to only benefit the people that, the legacy institutions that were doing that anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And that's once a company spends all this time and money and other resources on their method, it's like they try to force it on other people to try to cause them to have to spend money making sure their product is up to a certain quality, or that their production processes adhere to certain standards, or what one company considers a safety standard. Now everyone's got to follow that. And that, of course, a lot of times companies can't handle that. So the smaller companies, you go out of business. And so that's a big part of offensive lobbying. You're trying to initiate this. In defensive lobbying is somewhat is related, but this is when another special interest is trying to say, like advocate for some government policies that are going to benefit them at your expense, right? Say, smaller companies might actually band together and they're advocating for something like antitrust law that's going to hurt a large company. And what the company in question now needs to do is they need to play defense. They need to intercept the football, so to speak, right? They need to either kill the bill or they need to lobby and behind the scenes make sure it's changed so it benefits them. And this is what companies are always doing. They did it after the Civil War through the Progressive Era, and they're still doing it today.
Yeah, it's so often true. God, there's so much about which we could speak. I just mentioned in passing. When I was a very young man, I went on a tour in Latin America, and I was shocked to discover that all the family owned coffee plantations, it was small plots. They were growing coffee and roasting it. Were furious at what was called the fair trade coffee movement at the time. So these are the big players of coffee importers working with the largest corporations in Latin America. I mean, so really the cronies of the coffee world had figured up a scheme to market their products as fair trade because they're paying their workers high benefits or whatever. And so if you have a conscience, if you were an enlightened consumer, you would only buy fair trade coffee because that benefits the workers. Well, these small families, all over Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and everywhere, we're like, what the hell? What about us? We're struggling with the big businesses around here, and it's making us crazy because they're embedded with government. And now you loopy-doopy weirdos in the U.S. are buying this line that somehow by buying their products from big business, that's fair trade. Whereas we're over here exploiting our workers. No, we're just trying to make a buck, and survive. So that was a very early clue in my life, and I'm still even as telling the story, I can't get over it. Right? It still makes me mad.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you see the fair trade, and you go, oh well, this is going to benefit the people, right? And then it doesn't, right? But that's all part of the that's all part of the game, right? Yeah. One of the most fascinating things that I uncovered in this book are just overall themes, and this is something that admittedly comes from Rothbard because Rothbard had studied this a lot too and always advocated this. Is it's when special interests are lobbying and they're advocating for legislation in the public interest, they're almost always in some form, if they want to be successful at least, they are allying with intellectuals, right? It's the alliance of throne and altar, so to speak. You have the king allies with the priest, and it's a little bit of quid pro quo. Look, I'll give you a fancy church. You just got to tell the people that, I'm divine and to listen to me. And now we have intellectuals that will, basically justify various policies, interventions by the Federal Reserve, health and safety standards, foreign wars, whatever, on the grounds that it will benefit the public, right? And that's part of the deal making that goes on, because it's during this rise of the corporatist state, we really start to see intellectuals, which I'm broadly defining as anyone from a professor in academia to even more trade groups like lawyers, economists, accountants, doctors, so on and so forth. They're becoming more powerful. Yeah, journalists.
Yeah.
Journalists. Yeah, that's another one. And they're all there because as part of this, what's in it for them is that they get nice jobs. They get government subsidies to do research, or they get a position in the government bureaucracy through the civil service, or tenure at a prestigious university or something like that, or they're getting paid consulting fees by these businesses that are receiving privileges. and someone's buttering their bread, so to speak. And really this began in earnest. Of course, there were always examples before, but this really began in earnest in the early 20th century. And that was all part of the public interest narrative. They had to put a spin on all of these policies, right?
Over the last 6 years, I remember there was some weird moment where I was reading something about, I don't know, pandemic policy or something, and there was a guy who said something I just found ridiculous and absurd. And I was talking to a friend, and he said, "Well, of course, you can't trust what that guy says. He's a science journalist. There's not a single science journalist in this country who's not captured by industry." And I thought, that's a hell of a conspiracy theory. Really? And of course, now, 6 years later, yes, that's very obvious. Of course that's true.
Yeah.
You need the intellectuals to explain why this exploitative system is actually great for the public, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's how governments survive, and of course that's how the rulers of the government survive, the political and the economic elites, and that was I guess I would say one of the big differences between cronyism in the past, say in the 1800s in the United States, versus cronyism in the 1900s. You of course had intellectuals and journalists defending certain policies, tariffs, or the first or the second Bank of the United States back in the day, but and then even the railroad grants of the Civil War. But really in the quote unquote progressive era in the 20th century, for the Federal Trade Commission, for the Federal Reserve System, for all the food and drug legislation, you really start to see the rise of a professionalized intellectual class, right? Or really a caste. And as you mentioned, now, they're all, if you want to be successful in a particular field, you want to publish in the prestigious journals, you want to present at the prestigious conferences and so on, you're not going to criticize the biggest employers, right? Or at least you're going to be less incentivized to do so. And it's just a fascinating seeing the development of that.
It's fascinating. And when you first explain this to people, they think maybe you're out of your mind. I remember the first time I ever heard somebody explain to me that the climate change, global warming thing was really just a kind of a cartel of intellectuals, that if you disagreed with this, that you would be sort of professionally ruined. And I thought, how could that possibly be true? How could that be true? Because now it seems, unbelievably apparent that that's true. And the same thing almost happened with the transgender stuff, in the craziest way. Well, anyway, let's just go back here really quickly, because we're just doing a quick overview. But the progressive era is something about which we could speak forever. Murray Rothbard wrote a whole book on it, and you are covering this in wonderfully great detail, in part relying on the work of Gabriel Kolko, who's always been one of my favorite historians, and he was one of Murray's favorite historians.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kolko, particularly he's known for his two books, Railroads and Regulations, and then The Triumph of Conservatism. In not as conservatism as a political movement, but the triumph of, like, let's say, conservative special interests.
He means the triumph of corporatism, essentially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Kolko really kind of he was one of the first to sort of turn the traditional narrative of, let's say, like the late 19th to early 20th centuries on its head, because what had existed before and what is still dominant in, say, textbooks and even the media is that you had all these businesses, they had achieved all these monopolies, they were causing all sorts of problems, they were exploiting workers, they were causing the business cycle, so on and so forth. And then you needed the progressive era, you needed the reformers to clean up the economy and the government, to drive out, bribery and corruption, to institute fair labor conditions, to institute product quality, to create a central bank, to get rid of the business cycle, to apply, enforce antitrust, to stop monopolies, and so on and so forth. And Kolko, and he wrote these books. They came out in the early 1960s. He really turned that narrative on its head, and he said, actually, businesses were extremely competitive before this government intervention, and actually the large companies, they were losing their market share. And then they were the major players lobbying the government for special privileges. Mm-hmm. And that is the basics of course, Rothbard's analysis of the progressive era, my analysis in this book. And they're fascinating books. And it definitely have built on them and tried to explore some of the archival work in more depth, and just sort of read the sources as best I can, and integrate new research on the subject. But once you have that narrative, like once that's overturned, it's really hard to overturn that narrative, to say like, oh yeah, this new way is wrong. But then you're also always just kind of thinking, of course you want to make sure you're doing the necessary work to prove it, but you're trained to now look at the modern world and to say, wait a second, right? What they're saying in the news might not be what's actually happening. It could be the companies that are actually lobbying for this. Or we're always told every time, this time it's different. This new technology, you're going to have a monopoly. E-commerce, well, now you're going to have Amazon dominate the world, or AI. Now you're going to have one company, they're going to dominate. And as Kolko had showed in the past, and as what we continually see, you can have a couple of large companies and they can be in fierce competition with each other. And that is a powerful driver of the market that we often forget about. And of course, people don't give the market any credit for it. And then they say, oh, we need government intervention and so on and so forth. But the real history is different.
Where does your book go on the matter of the Great War?
Yeah, so World War I is a big part of it. So once I get into the actual corporatist era proper, about 1897 to 1929, I really extend the progressive era beyond. A lot of people ended at World War I, but I show like, no, it was a fulfillment of it, and it even continued in the 1920s. It certainly was an era where businesses were trying to cartelize and get the government to provide various privileges from them. What I find fascinating, and this is sort of the grand finale of the book, so you got to get to the last chapter to get to it, is how much Wall Street was involved in financing the Allies, Great Britain and France, namely, before the United States got involved, and how much of you could say, a special interest they were in getting the United States to enter the war, right? Now, Wall Street, there were some firms that were actually opposed to the United States getting into the war. But of course, JP Morgan and Company, which we still see today as JP Morgan and Chase, was very much interested in getting the United States involved, because they had lent a lot of money to Britain and France. And if those countries lost, then Britain and France wouldn't really be able to pay them. So they were a huge interest group in getting the United States in the war. And once you see the war, once you see the United States in the war, you really start to see this huge development of the corporatist state through the War Industries Board, and I think the Food Administration of Herbert Hoover, and all these regimented standards and price controls, of course, all in the name of the war effort, right? That really regimented the economy. And it was really a true corporatist state. And then you had industry, you had labor, you had intellectuals, and they were all sort of fighting to get their own special privileges. And then I argue that by the 1920s, of course, you saw a huge decrease in government intervention, but the corporatist state still remained. It was not laissez-faire in the 1920s. and the dominant player, the dominant interest group was Wall Street and related big businesses.
Yeah, and the munitions industry, which has makes a huge go of it, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So go on. Sorry.
Yeah, and that this became something of a public controversy after the Great War. Well, who was it that benefited from this? Because there was so many people were hurt. We had, a sort of lost generation. We had the Forgotten America and the Forgotten Man, all these things, and then you had these books coming out, Graft and Business, and what was it? One of the great exposés of the war, the Merchants of Death. That's what I'm trying to think of, the Merchants of Death. So and people were scandalized, I think, at the time, and the investigations looking backwards, like what the hell was this?
Yeah, exactly. And those investigations, I think they were the Nye Committee in the 1930s. I do draw on some of the say testimony and other research from that era, even though I'm not up to the 1930s yet, because the munitions industry and related industries, steel, making of motors and trucks and in bullets and even electricity, radios, the lights that could be used by the Army and so on. So many of those companies, as Rothbard originally kind of hinted at in some of his work, and he pointed out, were related to or were affiliated with J.P. Morgan and Company, U.S. Steel. Okay, that was a J.P. Morgan company. General Electric, right, which is still, of course, around. That was a J.P. Morgan company, and they were very involved in the war effort. Of course, the DuPonts were the main family involved in some of the more specific war. War goods and services, I guess you could say. But yeah, it was a bit of a scandal. Some of it, not sensationalized isn't the right word, but of course, it was amplified because that was a big part of getting Americans, at least a little bit wary of getting involved in another European conflict, and for good reason, because World War I really didn't do a whole lot for the United States. You could almost argue it's responsible for all of a lot of problems in the 20th and even 21st centuries.
Yeah. Well, I just can't. Oh, have you? Let's see. By going all the way up to 1929, you covered Prohibition.
Briefly, yeah, I talk about that in the context of the food and drug regulations, because really the main driver behind the Pure Food and Drug Act was this guy named Harvey Washington Wiley. You can think of him as the Anthony Fauci of yesteryear, right? And he was allied with various interests, and he played favorites with the food companies he was allied with. He was a big defender of straight whiskey as opposed to, I think, rectified whiskey. And then, he was advocating for all sorts of basically only these types of foods can be produced, or you have to have these derogatory labels on them and so on. And of course, one of the aftermath, you could say, of a lot of his efforts was Prohibition. And when the alcohol quality went down the tubes, because then you had people trying to drink industrial alcohol, right? And instead of, because they were trying to make it in their bathtubs and so on. And you look at alcohol deaths and poisoning, and then those went up because the quality of alcohol went down because people were forced onto the black market. So Prohibition gets a little mention in the book. It makes a cameo appearance.
I have never heard that story before. That is so remarkable. What other gems are in your book? This is amazing.
Well, we spoke about lobbyists. So then we spoke about Prohibition. Talked about World War I and intellectuals. Fascinating is, this might come as a shock and surprise, but it's accountants were a major interest group behind the income tax, right? You know, this could shock you, right? This could be a big surprise. But yes, accountants were behind. They were an interest group. They were excited for the income tax, and of course, as tax law developed, they made sure that, well, it was just complicated enough, right? Where you had to, back in the day, you had to buy a manual or a book written by an accountant, how to file your taxes. Or you'd have to hire an accountant if you were a business or a really wealthy individual. And they were very interested, I think, in seeing the preparation of efficient tax legislation, something, right? So that's the accountants for you. And yeah, so there's lots of little gems. It's a book that you can read from start to finish, or you could pick it up and just read chapters or even certain paragraphs, and I guarantee you'll learn something.
Well, and to your point, this is why you keep emphasizing this in this interview. You keep saying, look, it's a matter of how you look at things. Like, once you know where to look, keep looking, and you're going to find the thing. But it doesn't jump out at you, because necessarily all these things they tend to be hidden behind rhetoric, and it's not immediately obvious, but if you know what you're looking for, you're eventually going to find it.
Exactly. So all good history, you have to be a detective, right? But you also have to have that interpretive framework, that theoretical framework. And so it's really about uncovering who are the special interests, who's behind something, who's expecting to benefit, who actually benefits, right? And that's the struggle, so to speak.
Well, I can't say enough about what you're doing, Patrick. I think it's just remarkable. You're doing what a historian should do. So, people don't have to give up on academia or the intellectual world entirely because of people like you. I'm so thrilled about this book, and I hope it makes a big difference. People should absolutely read it and hang on to every word. And I'm happy to. This is I think our first time sort of meeting, certainly. And I didn't realize that you're such a young scholar. That's really interesting to me. So that makes me very, very happy. I'm so thrilled about this project and this book and all the work that's coming. So I just want to thank you for hanging out with me just briefly on this interview. And I hope this serves as a good introduction to the powerful paradigm you've put together. And I will add that your book is extremely readable. It's in English. It's not designed to be forbidding like a lot of academic work. So you really are a great storyteller in addition to everything else.
Oh, well, thank you so much for the kind words. Yeah, it's been a pleasure going on your show to talk about this book. I'm excited to promote the book, and I hope people find it interesting. And I appreciate your kind words about being a good storyteller. And I'll say it took a lot of editing, and my wife was a major help in this, and helping edit it and encouraging me to make it better. And I'm just grateful to be doing something that I love to do, and I've got a lot of passion and motivation. And so it's not the last book that I'll ever write, right? There's more to come.
Joey Rothbard was also an enormous help to Murray. I don't know, he wouldn't have been able to do what he did without him. So I'm glad to see the Rothbardian spirit lives on. Thank you so much, Patrick Newman. All the best.
Thanks for having me.